when black restaurant critic Lauren Brooks was refused a table solely because of her skin color, she decided to expose the hidden prejudices of the restaurant owner for all the city to see. Her actions would set off a chain of events that would upend his life and force him to question his own beliefs. What she decides to do next will surprise even those who think they've seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. George Mackay's restaurant, owned by a well-known white restaurateur, was packed. Soft lighting, jazz music, and poised waiters gliding between tables created the atmosphere of a perfect evening. George, bustling from one area to another, observed the crowd, scrutinizing every detail as if each guest's presence could make or break the reputation of his establishment. Lauren Brooks, a black woman elegantly dressed in a sleek dark suit, paused by the hostess stand with a clutch in hand. Her manners were refined, her smile calm and confident, qualities that would normally win over any hostess. Yet upon seeing her, the hostess tensed, a reaction not unnoticed by George. Spotting her at the entrance, he grimaced, sensing this woman did not, in his mind, meet his establishment's standards. Lauren moved to the stand, but the hostess, glancing briefly at George, blatantly ignored her. "Good evening," Lauren said, trying to catch his attention. "I have a reservation under the name Lauren Brooks." The hostess responded with a faint sneer, his eyes flicking to George, who frowned, clearly unwilling to let her in. An awkward pause hung in the air before George stepped forward, looking at Lauren with unconcealed disdain. "Apologies, but it appears we have no reservation under that name. We're fully booked tonight," he said coolly. Lauren was taken aback. She had confirmed her reservation earlier that morning, knowing her visit to George Mackay's was not just dinner, but work. She was reviewing the place for one of the city's most popular columns. Lauren was a renowned restaurant critic, whose reviews reached thousands, and her opinion could elevate a restaurant's status or trigger an outcry. "Excuse me, but I have a confirmed reservation," she replied calmly but firmly, reaching for her phone to show the booking. George cut her off, nodding toward the door. "I told you, we're fully booked. And," he looked at her with thinly veiled disdain, "next time perhaps you'd find something more suitable," he added, almost in a whisper, with pointed contempt. Moments later, the jazz-filled room caught the tension in the air. A few patrons turned their heads, some of the waiters pausing, ready for cues from their employer. A surge of indignation rose within Lauren. She wanted to prove that judging people by their appearance or skin color, let alone barring someone with honest intentions, was wrong. But she realized that pressing further would only deepen her humiliation. Holding back the tremor in her voice, she spoke, enunciating each word. "I understand. I regret that you treat your guests this way, Mr. Mackay." Her voice carried no threat, yet her steady tone was a challenge. George merely shrugged, satisfied he'd had the final word, as Lauren, turning slowly, held her head high and left the restaurant. Her back straightened, her gaze steely and focused. She walked away, aware of the eyes following her and leaving behind an atmosphere of quiet tension. Outside, Lauren paused, looking up at the sign and recalling the countless other black patrons who, like her, had faced this treatment in places where they weren't wanted. Was this right? Her keen sense of justice answered firmly, no. More resolute than ever, she knew she would tell this story so that establishments could no longer get away with open discrimination unpunished. The next morning, still feeling the anger and disappointment from her refusal, Lauren went straight to her editor, Mr. Henderson, and briefly recounted the incident at George Mackay's restaurant. An experienced and perceptive journalist, he immediately grasped the story's importance. It could spark a powerful exposé and draw public attention to the issues of racism and bias. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, knowing how committed Lauren was to her profession and how impactful the article could be. "More than sure," Lauren replied, her gaze steady. "This needs to be heard." Lauren got to work quickly, reaching out to other black residents of the city who shared similar experiences at various establishments. She discovered she wasn't alone in facing unwarranted refusals or dismissive treatment. At a veterans club, she heard the story of an older black man turned away from a restaurant for inappropriate attire despite being dressed neatly and conservatively. These accounts only fueled her determination. Day after day, Lauren continued her investigation, gathering evidence and testimonials on George Mackay and his establishment. She contacted fellow critics and journalists, asking if they, too, had encountered such incidents at his restaurant. Soon, her inbox was filled with responses, not only from victims, but from witnesses who had seen other black patrons met with cold indifference or open hostility. One of the most recent replies came from a young activist who offered to share the article widely through his social networks. This amplified the case's reach, and Lauren realized her story could become more than just an exposé of restaurant prejudice. Finally, she had enough material for her article. She detailed not only her own experience, but those of others, explaining how deeply ingrained discrimination was in local establishments, vividly describing the atmosphere at George's restaurant, where she had been so openly humiliated. She concluded with a call for change, emphasizing the need for equal treatment of all guests, regardless of race or appearance. When the article was ready for publication, her editor read it, nodded approvingly, and said, "This is it. This story is going to make waves." Lauren knew her article would be explosive, and she was prepared for the impact. Within days, Lauren's article appeared in a major city publication and its online version, immediately drawing readers' attention. The headline boldly declared, "Refused service, how prejudice and racism go unchecked in one of the city's top restaurants." The article spread across social media, receiving hundreds of comments. Many voiced outrage in support of Lauren, sharing their own similar experiences. The public reaction was overwhelming. By the morning of the publication, George Mackay's restaurant, once seen as the epitome of taste and class, became a target of outrage and criticism. Lauren's move sparked a storm. Local activists called for a boycott. The restaurant's social media page flooded with angry comments, and its ratings plummeted. People from neighboring cities even vowed to avoid a business that chose patrons based on skin color. George, shocked by the backlash, was initially at a loss. Just the day before, his restaurant was thriving, but in mere hours, he felt the full weight of public condemnation. His managers reported numerous cancellations, and regular patrons stopped answering calls. In an attempt to calm himself, George told himself this would soon blow over. He contacted a PR agent for advice, but the agent warned that without an immediate response and apology, the situation would be hard to control. Yet George's pride prevented him from admitting any fault. "No one tells me who I can serve," he stubbornly stated, unaware that this would only worsen his situation. Lauren and her supporters continued to raise awareness on social media, drawing ever more attention to the story. Meanwhile, youth groups supporting Lauren launched a campaign for equal rights, circulating information about the incident and questioning the restaurant's reputation. Under mounting public pressure, journalists from across the country took interest in the case, and soon Lauren was invited to speak on television. She shared her experience, emphasizing that her story was just one example of the systemic inequality and discrimination faced by many black individuals. During her live interview, thousands of viewers saw Lauren's genuine resolve and her desire to change public perceptions. Meanwhile, George's reputation continued to spiral downward. People left scathing reviews on the restaurant's website, and business partners began distancing themselves, wary of being drawn into the scandal. George found himself in a tight corner. His pride and refusal to admit fault were wrecking his business in plain view. Realizing he could no longer ignore the problem, George made a difficult decision. He agreed to a public apology, understanding his business was on the verge of collapse. Under public pressure, George Mackay announced he was ready to apologize. Local residents, activists, journalists, and Lauren herself filled the press room, eagerly waiting to hear his statement. In the tense silence, George stepped to the podium, visibly nervous. Confusion and fear were clear in his eyes as he realized his restaurant's future hinged on this moment. "I'm here to apologize," he began, though his words came with difficulty. He tried explaining that he had always cared for the reputation of the establishment, but people began murmuring in disappointment, sensing his lack of sincerity. Lauren stood in the audience, watching him closely as his gaze finally met hers. In her eyes, he saw both determination and a certain exhaustion from a fight she shouldn't have had to undertake. "I was wrong," George finally admitted, his shoulders dropping. "I see now I can no longer ignore what's been happening in my restaurant. I shouldn't have judged people by appearance or skin color." A silence fell, and Lauren used the moment to ask, "Mr. McKay, what are you going to do to change this?" Her voice was firm and accusing, though without hostility. George looked back, feeling his old views crumble. He knew an apology wasn't enough. "I want my restaurant to be a place for everyone," he replied, struggling with his words. "I'm committed to training my staff, including myself. We need to learn to see people as people, not through any kind of filter." Lauren nodded, and the journalists recorded his words. The meeting ended, but the story wasn't over. Over the following weeks, the restaurant began changing its policies. George arranged training sessions with local activists covering inclusion and equality, and even invited Lauren for a symbolic dinner to thank her for her intervention. This move took the city by surprise, and public opinion gradually softened. Soon, people began returning to the restaurant, realizing change was possible even in unexpected places. For George, this was not just a lesson, but a journey of transformation. He gained not only a new reputation, but also respect for people he had once underestimated.